The bus groaned to a stop at the edge of a town so small it barely warranted a sign. She stepped down onto gravel, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and watched the taillights shrink into the heat shimmer of the highway. Nobody else got off. Nobody was waiting. She'd read the lawyer's note so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Hollow Ridge Vineyard, County Road 9, 3 miles past the Baptist Church. Property of the estate of your grandmother. No warmth in it, no explanation, just an address and a signature, and the fact that she was, apparently, the only living relative anyone could find. 19 years old, and everything she owned fit in one bag. The lawyer's office in the city had been quick about it. 15 minutes, a folder, a handshake that felt more like a dismissal. "Land's not worth much," he'd said, not looking up from his desk. "Nobody's touched it in 30 years. County almost took it for back taxes twice." He hadn't asked where she'd sleep that night. She hadn't told him she'd been asking herself the same question for the better part of a year, since the last foster placement ended and the checks stopped and the world quietly decided she was old enough now to disappear into. She started walking. The road out of town turned to gravel, then to something barely better than a suggestion, weeds pushing up through cracks that hadn't seen a grader in years. Fields on either side had gone wild, fence posts leaning, wire slack and rusted, an old tractor sunk to its axles in a ditch like it had given up mid-thought. Cicadas sawed away in the heat. Her sneakers weren't built for 3 miles of country road, but she'd walked farther on worse. The church came up on her right, white paint gone gray, a hand-lettered sign out front announcing a potluck from what looked like months ago. Past it, the land began to climb. Low hills, once terraced, she realized, squinting. Rows. Actual rows. Ghost straight even under 30 years of neglect. Running up the slope like the bones of something that used to be alive. She stopped at the top of the rise and looked down at what was left of Hollow Ridge. The vines had gone feral, thick tangled ropes of them swallowing whatever trellis system had once held them upright, spilling over into the aisles between rows until there was no telling where one row ended and the next began. Beyond the vineyard sat a farmhouse, windows dark, porch sagging on one corner like a tired shoulder. A barn stood further back, its roofline dipping in the middle, one wall bowed outward like it was holding its breath. No power lines that she could see running to the house, no sign of another living soul for a mile in any direction. She adjusted the strap on her duffel bag and started down the hill toward the only thing in the world that was hers. The porch steps groaned, but held when she tested them with one boot, then her full weight. The front door hung slightly open, swollen in its frame from years of rain finding the gap under the eave. She pushed it wider and stepped into a front room thick with dust and the smell of old wood and mouse droppings. A couch sat sunken in the middle, springs gone, and someone had left a coffee cup on the side table decades ago, ring stains dried into rust-colored circles on the wood. She didn't linger there. She moved room to room, mental notes stacking up the way they always did when she was sizing up a place to stay, which places she'd learned to do fast, in shelters and church basements and the backs of cars. Kitchen, dry sink. Hand pump looked seized but maybe not broken. 2 bedrooms, one with a caved section of ceiling where the roof had let go, sky visible through the boards, a soft carpet of leaves and old insulation heaped on the floor beneath it. The other bedroom was smaller, drier, window intact. That one she filed away as possible. Outside again, she circled the house, then the barn, careful of where she stepped. The barn's bowed wall worried her more than the house did. That kind of lean meant rot in the sill, meant the whole structure could come down without much warning. She didn't go inside it yet. Just noted the double doors chained shut, with a padlock gone to solid rust, easy enough to cut through later if she found the right tool. Then she walked the rows. Up close, the vines were worse and better than they'd looked from the ridge. Worse because the trunks were buried in 3 decades of their own runaway growth, canes as thick as her wrist wound around each other like they were trying to strangle something. Better because underneath all that wildness the bones were sound. Old trellis posts, gray and weathered but still standing straight in most places, wire strung between them gone slack but unbroken. Somebody had built this to last. Whoever had walked away from it hadn't walked away because the land failed them. She crouched at the base of one vine, worked her fingers down through the tangle to the trunk itself, thick and gnarled as a fist. Alive. She could feel it. Whatever had happened here, whatever had made her grandmother's family scatter and this place go silent, the vines hadn't cared. They just kept growing, wild and untended, waiting. She stood in the middle of the row and turned in a slow circle. Hillside, farmhouse, barn, the long silence pressing in from every direction. No neighbors close enough to hear her if she called out. No power, no water she'd tested yet, no money to speak of, and $11 folded in her jacket pocket. But it was hers. Paper said so, and paper was more than she'd had a week ago. She hitched the duffel higher on her shoulder and walked back toward the barn, toward that rusted padlock, wanting to see what was behind it before the light went. The padlock didn't give, not that evening. She worked at it with a flat rock until her palm blistered, then made herself stop. Cellar or barn or whatever waited behind that rust could keep till morning. A person needed a roof more than she needed answers, and the light was already going amber and thin over the ridge. The farmhouse kitchen was the least ruined room in a house that had given up on itself. Water stains bloomed brown across the ceiling plaster, and something had chewed a hole clean through the pantry door, but the wood stove still stood square on its legs, and the flue, when she checked it with a bent coat hanger from her duffel, wasn't blocked. She swept 2 decades of mouse droppings and dead leaves into a pile with a broom she found leaning behind the door, its bristles worn to a stub, but still usable. She scrubbed the counter with rainwater collected in an old coffee can and a rag torn from her spare shirt. It wasn't clean. It was clearable, which was different, and enough. She found a claw hammer and a bow saw hanging on nails in the mudroom, spotted with rust but sound at the edges once she worked a whetstone over them. A pair of leather work gloves, stiff as cardboard, softened some when she flexed them open and closed 100 times sitting on the porch step. Small mercies. She counted them like money, because right now they were worth more than the $11 folded in her pocket. Morning came gray and cool, and she walked the near row again in full daylight, this time with the saw in hand instead of just her eyes. Up close, the neglect was worse than the hillside view had let on. Blackberry canes had woven themselves into the trellis wire so thick in places that vine and bramble were one tangled rope, impossible to tell apart without cutting. Saplings had rooted at the base of at least a dozen vines, cedar and locust, their roots surely fighting the grape roots below ground for whatever water there was. She started at the end nearest the farmhouse, cutting brambles back in armloads, dragging them clear so she could see trunk from vine from wire. 2 hours in, her hands ached, and she'd cleared maybe 15 feet of a row that ran the length of a football field, one row out of, she counted from where she stood, 9, maybe 10, climbing the slope in long parallel lines toward the tree line. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and let herself actually look at the scale of it for the first time. Not a garden, not a hobby plot. Acres. Whoever had planted this had meant it to last generations, and it had waited through most of one already, patient as stone, for somebody to come back and finish what got left undone. She wiped her forehead with her sleeve and reached for the saw again. The barn would still be there when she was done. By late afternoon, her arms wouldn't lift the saw anymore, so she left the vines and walked the rest of the way up toward the barn, figuring she could at least take stock of what was inside before dark. The doors hung crooked on their hinges, one dragging a groove in the dirt where it had been opened and closed 1,000 times before rust seized the tracks. Inside smelled of old hay and mouse droppings and something sourer underneath, vinegar gone to must. Light came through gaps in the board siding in long, dusty stripes, enough to see by if she waited for her eyes to adjust. She'd hoped for tools. A vineyard this size needed pruning shears, wire, stakes, maybe a tractor rusting under a tarp, and she started working the perimeter with that in mind, kicking through collapsed shelving, old feed sacks gone to powder, a workbench with half its top rotted through. She found a coil of wire that might still be usable, a few hand tools with split handles she could replace. Not nothing, not enough either. It was the back wall that stopped her. Where the other 3 walls were open, hung with old harness leather and empty nail hooks, the back wall was choked floor to rafters with barrels, dozens of them, stacked and fallen and restacked by gravity alone, staves burst and sprung, hoops rusted to lace. Some had collapsed into each other so completely they'd formed a kind of dry, splintered dam, and she had to climb over the leading edge of it to get close enough to touch. The wood crumbled under her hand like old bread. She almost turned back right there. It would take a full day just to clear this, and for what? More empty barrels, more rot. But something about the shape of the pile nagged at her, the way it followed too straight a line at the base, like it had been stacked against something rather than simply fallen there over time. She pulled a few loose staves away, coughing at the dust that rose, and worked her hand into the gap behind them. Stone. Cold, dressed stone, mortared smooth, running level along the base of the wall, where there should have been nothing but packed dirt floor and the barn's own foundation timbers. She sat back on the crumbling barrels and stared at it. A root cellar wall wouldn't be built into the back of a barn like this, hidden behind a deliberate barricade of ruined casks. She pulled more staves free, working faster now despite the ache in her hands, and the stone edge kept going, up and to the side, further than a foundation had any business extending. Whoever stacked those barrels hadn't been careless. They'd been covering something up. She spent the next 3 days doing nothing but hauling rotten wood. Each morning she woke stiff on the farmhouse floor, ate what little she'd rationed from the last trip into town, and walked out to the barn before the dew burned off. The barrel staves came apart easier than she expected, but there were so many of them, decades of collapsed casks, stacked and restacked, packed tight enough that she had to work them loose one at a time or risk a wall of rot falling on top of her. Her palms blistered, then calloused. She learned to wrap her hands in old feed sack cloth and keep going anyway. By the 3rd afternoon, the stone face stood clear from floor to shoulder height, a good 8 feet across, too deliberate to be anything but built with purpose. Running her fingers along the mortar lines, she found a seam that didn't match the rest, a straight vertical cut, hinges rusted flush into the stone, and a rectangular slab set into a frame so precisely fitted that if she hadn't been searching for it, she'd have walked past it 100 times without noticing. A door. Someone had built a door into the back wall of a barn and then buried it under a wrecking yard of broken barrels. She found an iron ring sunk into a recess at waist height, half swallowed by rust, and worked at it with a rag soaked in the last of her engine oil until it turned loose in the socket. Then she pulled. Nothing happened for a long moment except her own breath and the creak of old metal complaining. She braced a boot against the stone, threw her weight backward, and the door gave all at once with a groan that sounded like the whole barn exhaling. Cool air rolled out to meet her, damp and mineral, carrying a smell she hadn't breathed in years but recognized instantly. Cellar air, earth and old wood, and something faintly sweet underneath it, like fruit gone to memory. She stood in the opening with her lantern raised, and the light fell across rows of shapes stacked in wooden racks along both walls, farther back than the lantern could properly reach. Bottles, dozens of them, maybe more, laid on their sides in neat diagonal cradles, dust so thick on the glass it looked like felt. Beyond them, barrels, real ones, whole ones, resting on iron cradles instead of dirt, their staves dark and tight, nothing like the ruin she'd spent 3 days clearing outside. Nobody had touched any of it in 30 years. She could tell by the undisturbed dust, by the spiderwebs strung heavy between rack and ceiling beam, by the way the air itself seemed to have been waiting, sealed and unbreathed since somebody had shut that door and buried it under broken casks on purpose. She stepped inside slowly, lantern trembling just slightly in her grip, and started counting bottles. She counted 41 bottles before she lost track, distracted by the labels. Handwritten, faded to the color of weak tea, most of them illegible except for a year here and there. 1961, 1958, one that might have said 1964, though the ink had bled into the paper until it was more suggestion than word. She didn't touch them yet. She wanted to, badly, but something about disturbing them felt like waking someone who'd been asleep a long time and deserved a few more minutes of quiet. Instead, she moved deeper, following the lantern light along the rack wall, past the whole barrels resting easy on their iron cradles, until the space narrowed and the shelving gave way to a low wooden workbench built into the stone. A rusted hand-crank corker sat bolted to one end. Beside it, half buried under a fall of dust and a curl of dead cobweb, sat a tin box the size of a bread loaf, its seams gone orange with rust, a small brass padlock fused shut through the hasp. She set the lantern on the bench and picked the box up with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, something shifting inside when she tilted it. Papers, by the sound, not coins, not anything hard. The padlock didn't yield to her fingers, but the hasp itself was thin, corroded enough that when she worked her multi-tool blade under the edge and levered hard, the screws tore loose from the wood with a small shriek of protest. The lid came up stiff, hinges groaning like they hadn't opened since Kennedy was in office. Inside lay 3 notebooks, cloth-bound, their covers soft and furred with age, and beneath them a single folded document, the paper gone brittle and the color of weak coffee. She lifted the notebooks out first, careful as handling eggs, and opened the top one under the lantern light. The handwriting was small, slanted, economical, rows of dates, temperatures, notes on pruning and pressing and fermentation times, sketched diagrams of trellis wire in the margins. Her grandmother's hand. She recognized it from the one birthday card she'd kept for years before it got lost, along with everything else she used to own. She set the journals aside, reverent, and unfolded the document last. It wasn't what she expected. Not a will, not a letter. A deed, official, county-stamped, describing a parcel of land she'd never heard mentioned once, not in the note that brought her here, not in anything her mother had ever said in the scattered years before she died. A second parcel, acreage adjoining the vineyard, or near it, the boundary description full of surveyor's language she didn't understand yet but intended to. She sat back on her heels in the cold cellar air, the lantern hissing softly beside her, and read the description over twice, 3 times, trying to place it against the land she already knew, and finding, with a small cold thrill down her spine, that she couldn't place it at all. She folded the deed along its old creases and set it on top of the journals, a problem for daylight, for the county office, for a mind that wasn't half frozen and running on cold coffee. Tonight there was only the lantern and the small slanted handwriting, and she made herself focus on that instead, because the land could wait, but the vines could not. She carried the journals up to the farmhouse kitchen and spread them across the table under the good lamp, the one with the steady wick, and began at the beginning. Her grandmother had not written for strangers. The entries assumed a reader who already knew the rows, the names of things, the rhythm of the seasons, so she had to read backward and forward at once, cross-referencing a March pruning note against a September harvest tally 3 books later, building the shape of a whole year's work out of fragments. She learned the dormant vines wanted cutting back hard, harder than she would have guessed, down to 2 or 3 buds on the strongest canes, and that her grandmother had marked which rows tolerated it and which didn't, little penciled crosses beside the stubborn ones. She learned about grafting, old rootstock, resistant to something that had apparently killed vines 2 farms over, back in the 50s, joined to the fruiting varieties her grandmother preferred. There were sketches of the graft unions, tiny and precise, whip and tongue cuts drawn like anatomy. In the morning, she took the pruning shears out to the first row nearest the barn and knelt in the mud and did exactly what the journal said, even though every instinct told her it was too much, too severe, that she was killing rather than saving. She cut anyway. Trusted the hand that had written it down 30 years before her own. By the 3rd day her palms had blistered through the gloves and her back ached in a new place every morning, but the rows behind her looked different, cleaner, smaller, deliberately shaped instead of wild. She worked from the journal propped open on a fence post, weighted with a stone against the wind, flipping pages with a wrist streaked in sap. The fermenting notes she copied into a notebook of her own, translating her grandmother's abbreviations into full sentences she could actually follow later, temperatures and timings, and the specific way she wanted the must stirred. She didn't have grapes yet to test any of it against, not this year, maybe not next, but she read it anyway, memorizing it the way she'd once memorized bus schedules and shelter addresses, because information was the one thing nobody could take from her once she had it. At the end of each day she went back down into the cellar, just to look at the deed again under the lantern, at the boundary lines she still couldn't place, and wondered what her grandmother had been protecting, and from whom. The press sat where it had fallen, half buried under a collapsed section of the barn's east wall, its iron frame furred with rust, and its wooden basin split along one seam like something that had tried to breathe and cracked instead. She found it on the 4th morning, dragging aside charred beams that crumbled to black dust in her hands, and when she finally uncovered the whole shape of it, she stood there a long moment just looking, because it was bigger than she'd expected, heavier, built to last generations rather than one harvest. It took the better part of a day to clear enough space to work around it, and another to rig a system of boards and a come-along borrowed logic she'd read once in a farm equipment manual at the library, easing the press inch by inch out from under the debris without breaking what was left of it. Her arms shook by the time it sat clear in the open dirt, tilted at an angle that made her wince, one leg of the frame bent from the weight that had crushed it. She spent the next 3 days with it the way she'd spent the first 3 with the vines, patient, methodical, refusing to let frustration decide anything. The gears inside the crank mechanism had seized with decades of rust, and she soaked them in a coffee can of kerosene, siphoned carefully from the truck, working them loose a fraction of a turn at a time, until they finally gave with a groan that startled a pair of crows off the fence line. The cracked basin she couldn't fix outright, but she found a woodworking chapter in one of the farmhouse's older books, something about coopering, and used it to understand how the staves had been fitted in the first place, how the iron hoops had held tension against the wood. She couldn't replace the split stave yet, she didn't have the tools or the exact wood, but she marked the size and shape onto a scrap of paper and tucked it into her notebook, another debt to pay later. The bent leg she straightened, using the come-along again, bracing the frame against a fence post and pulling slow, testing it, releasing, pulling again, until the whole press stood level for the first time since whatever fire or collapse had brought that wall down on top of it. She ran her palm along the crank, along the iron collar where a maker's stamp had once been legible and was now just a suggestion of letters, and thought about her grandmother turning this same handle, season after season, in a life Callie was only now starting to piece together backward. That evening she sat by the lantern in the cellar with the journal open again, this time to a page describing the press's tension settings, numbers that meant nothing to her yet but wouldn't stay that way. Outside, the rows waited, small and bare, and hers. Somewhere in the unclaimed boundary lines on the deed, she suspected, was the rest of the answer she hadn't found yet. The next morning, she laid everything out on the kitchen table in order, the deed with its odd second parcel description, the journal, and the folded county tax notice she'd found tucked behind the cellar's back shelf weeks ago and never fully read. She'd been saving it, maybe, without admitting why. Now she smoothed it flat under the lamp and read it straight through. Unpaid taxes. 2 consecutive years, then a lien notice, then a third year marked in a different hand, the ink darker, angrier almost, as if whoever filled it out had pressed too hard. She turned back to the journal and searched for the corresponding dates, flipping until she found an entry that matched the timeline, her grandmother's handwriting gone tight and small, the letters crowded together the way people write when they're trying not to feel what they're writing. He said the land wasn't worth saving if we couldn't agree what to do with it. I said it was worth saving because it was ours. He walked the northern line with the surveyor without telling me, had it split before I knew what he meant to do. I paid what I could from the harvest money. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough once he pulled his share. Callie read it twice, then set it down and stared at the deed again, the second parcel's boundary lines suddenly making sense in a different way. Not a mistake, not an oversight, but the leftover half of a split that had gone bad. A partnership, broken. A brother, a husband, a business partner, the journal didn't say which, not yet, who'd walked the property with a surveyor and cut it in 2, then let his half go to the county rather than pay into land he no longer wanted to share. The taxes had piled up on the whole property because nobody could agree who owed what, and when the debt got too big, the vineyard just stopped, not sold, not fought over in court, just abandoned, the way people abandon things they can't stand to look at anymore. She sat back, the lantern hissing softly, and thought about the collapsed barrels stacked deliberately against the cellar door, the boarded windows, the care someone had taken to seal a place instead of simply leaving it. That wasn't neglect. That was someone shutting a door on a memory too painful to keep in view. She found a scrap of paper and started listing what she still didn't know. Whose name was on the second parcel now? Whether the county still held it or had let it lapse further, whether her grandmother had ever tried to buy it back. The deed alone wouldn't answer that. She'd need the courthouse records, The same dusty ledgers she'd combed through once already for the will. Outside, the rose sat quiet under the early dark, patient the way vines are patient, waiting on decisions made decades before she was born to finally come due. The truck's engine coughed twice before catching, and she let it idle in the yard a full minute, the way the old man at the feed store had taught her, before pulling out onto the gravel road toward town. The county records office smelled the same as it had the first time: dust, floor wax, the metallic tang of old radiators, but this time she walked in knowing what she needed, instead of hoping to stumble onto it. The clerk behind the counter recognized her. "Back again for the Vineyard place?" "Second parcel this time," she said, and slid the deed across the counter, the paper soft as cloth from age. He squinted at the description, then disappeared into the back room where the plat books lived, tall as encyclopedias and twice as heavy. She waited on a wooden bench that had probably held 100 years of nervous, hopeful people, and tried not to let herself expect anything. When he came back, he had 2 books open, fingers marking pages. "Parcel's real, all right. Sits east of the main property, borders the creek. Never got folded into any tax sale, near as I can tell." He turned the book toward her. "Nobody's paid taxes on it since." He traced a column with his finger. 1961. "Nobody's owned it since then?" "Owned, maybe." "Claimed, no. Taxes went unpaid, but the county never seized it because whoever filed the original deed never re-recorded it under a corrected name. Clerical mess. Happens more than you'd think out here." He tapped the ledger. "Best I can tell, it sat in a kind of limbo. Nobody's contested it because nobody remembered it existed." She stared at the entry, the ink faded to rust brown, a name half legible beside it that could have been her grandmother's or could have been someone else's entirely. The partner, maybe, the one who'd walked away when the debts came due. What happens to land like that? Depends. If you can show a valid chain of title, deed, will, proof of descent, you can petition to have it formally recorded in your name. Pay what back taxes are owed, which won't be much on unclaimed land like this, and it's yours free and clear. He slid a form across the counter. Judge has to sign off, but it's not complicated if the paperwork lines up. She folded the form carefully into her coat pocket, the way she'd learned to fold anything that mattered, and thanked him. Outside, the afternoon had turned bright and cold, the kind of sky that made the whole valley look scrubbed clean. She stood on the courthouse steps a moment, thinking of the creek that must run along that unclaimed edge of ground, wondering what waited there. More vines, maybe, or nothing at all, but knowing now, for the first time, that it was hers to find. The drive back to the farmhouse felt shorter than it had ever felt, the truck rattling over the same ruts that had once seemed like the edge of nowhere and now felt like the road home. She parked by the barn and went straight to the journal, laying the courthouse form beside it on the workbench like 2 halves of the same map finally matched up. There wasn't time to dwell. The season had turned while she'd been chasing paper trails, and the vines didn't care about deeds or judges. They only cared about water, wire, and whether someone was paying attention. She walked the rows at dusk with a lantern, checking the grafts she'd made weeks earlier, the green shoots pushing thin and stubborn from the old rootstock. Some had taken, a few hadn't, the graft unions gone brown and dry, and she cut those back hard, the way the journal instructed, grafting fresh scion wood in the cool of morning before the sap could rise and ruin the cut. The trellis wire needed mending in a dozen places, rusted through where decades of neglect had let it sag and snap. She spent 3 days on her knees with pliers and a spool of new galvanized wire, splicing and tightening, propping leaning posts with fresh cedar stakes cut from the woodlot behind the barn. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then stopped complaining altogether. The press took longer than she expected. The old wooden gears had swollen and cracked over the years, and she replaced what she could with parts scavenged from a hardware store 2 towns over, fitting new leather gaskets by lamplight, testing the mechanism again and again until the screw turned smooth and true. When she finally cranked it through a full cycle, dry, with nothing in the basket, the whole barn seemed to hold its breath and then let it out in one long creaking sigh. By the time the days shortened and the mornings carried the first real bite of fall, the rows stood straighter than they had in 30 years, wire taut, posts plumb, grafts holding green against the coming cold. Clusters hung heavier on the vine than she'd dared hope, small and tight but real, the fruit of every hour she'd spent bent over the journal's fading handwriting. She stood at the end of the last row one evening, hands raw, back aching, and looked down the length of the vineyard toward the farmhouse, its windows catching the last orange light. Somewhere in the courthouse, the paperwork for the unclaimed acreage was moving through channels she couldn't hurry. Somewhere in the cellar, the old bottles waited beside the new ones she planned to fill. And somewhere out past the last row, unclaimed and unseen, that extra parcel of ground still waited for her to walk it. Harvest came on a Tuesday morning cold enough to fog her breath, and she picked the first true grapes in 30 years with her bare hands, filling one wooden lug at a time, the way the journal described, laying each cluster in gently so the skins wouldn't split. It took 2 full days, working the rows from first light until her fingers went numb, and when the last lug came in, she stood over the crush pad and simply looked at what she'd gathered. Modest, imperfect, hers. The press turned smooth when she finally loaded it, juice running dark and sweet through the channel she'd scrubbed clean months before, pooling into a barrel she'd resealed herself. She skimmed it the way the handwriting had taught her, tasted it raw and puckering, and laughed out loud at how far it was from wine, and how close it felt to one anyway. She carried buckets of must down the cellar stairs she'd rebuilt plank by plank, past the old bottles still resting in their dust-softened racks, and set the new barrel beside them, where the lantern light caught both the past and the beginning of whatever came next. The county paperwork came through that same week, a plain envelope with an official stamp, and she read it twice at the kitchen table before she let herself believe it. The unclaimed parcel, the one buried under decades of unpaid taxes and an old bitter falling out, was hers now, folded legally into the rest of the land under her own name. She drove into town, signed where she was told to sign, and walked out of the courthouse with the deed rolled under her arm like something too fragile to crease. She walked the new ground that same afternoon, past the last row of vines into acreage she'd never technically owned but had already come to think of as home. Rougher soil, a stand of old fruit trees gone wild, room enough to grow into for years. She stood there a long while, letting the wind move through grass no one had bothered to plant, thinking of the woman who'd hidden the deed in the first place, who'd loved this land enough to protect it even after losing everyone she'd shared it with. Back at the farmhouse that evening, she lit the lamps one by one, the windows glowing gold against the dark the way they must have decades before. She swept the porch, set 2 jars of new grape juice on the sill to finish, and sat down on the steps with the old journal open on her knee, its final pages nearly caught up to her own handwriting now. The vineyard stretched out below her, rows straight, cellar full, deed filed, name signed. For the first time in her life, nothing about the ground beneath her felt borrowed. It was hers, paid for in labor, in patience, in every hour she'd chosen to stay.